and welcome to Book Your Summer Live, and thank you for braving the hair-raising horror panel. We're here to raise your hair, raise heck, and quite possibly raise the dead. I'm Tricia Narwani, Editorial Director of Rey Books, and I'll be your moderator today. And I'm joined by a distinguished panel of ghouls and ghosts, aka some of the best horror novelists working today. I'll shortly turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll get the conversation warmed up with just a few questions. Then we'll move on to the real meat of this feast, questions from the audience. Now to our panelists, please take the stage, turn on your mics and video as you introduce yourselves, beginning with Alexis.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexis Henderson. I'm the author of The Year of the Witching, which just released this year, July 21st. It's my first book. I write dark fantasy and horror, and I'm a recent transplant to Columbus, Ohio, but I grew up in the South, which was like the inspiration behind a lot of my spooky, ghostly stories.
And next we have Josh.
Hi everyone, I am Josh Malerman, author of Bird Box and Malorie and others. I live in Michigan. If you've ever seen the movie 8 Mile, that is the border of Detroit, and I'm at 13 miles, so I'm about 5 miles outside of Detroit. And I live with a brilliant, bizarre artist, my fiance, Allison Laco.
And next up we have Alma.
Hi, I'm Alma Katsu. I write historical horror. Historical horror, I guess is how you can describe it. This is my most recent book. It's The Deep. It's a retelling of the sinking of the Titanic with a spooky little horror twist. My husband and I just recently relocated outside of the Washington, D.C. area. I am sitting here in the mountains of West Virginia, in the Allegheny Mountains, and I swear a bald eagle just flew by outside my window.
I think that's a good omen for our panel.
I hope so, yeah.
And finally, we have Riley.
Hey everyone, I'm Riley Sager. I am the author of Final Girls and the New York Times bestsellers The Last Time I Lied, Lock Every Door, and my latest book, Home Before Dark. I live outside of Princeton, New Jersey, in a house that is definitely not haunted, although we have bats in the attic. So that's something that we deal with every summer. And yeah, this is my office where you can see all my books, including, I think, all of them by my fellow panelist here. So yes, it's great.
Same to you guys.
Glad to be here.
Well, speaking of bats in the attic, I have a very serious and important question to begin with. What's your favorite monster? And we'll start with Alma.
Oh, well, you know, if you had asked me just a couple years ago, I probably would have said vampire because, you know, vampire. But I had the opportunity to write the foreword for an anthology that came out recently called Miscreations. And the concept behind it was, you know, man and monster, monster and man. And so a lot of them were, you know, sort of versions of the Frankenstein monster. And I really grew to have this appreciation for the Frankenstein monster and the pathos of that. So now I will say Frankenstein monster.
Next up, Alexis.
I'm a big fan of creepypasta. I read a lot of it like growing up, and I feel like that was very formative to me. So I have to give it to Slender Man, I think. He's pretty cool, he's great, and I love the way that he kind of collectively evolves through everyone sort of contributing their own Slender Man stories and myths on the internet. So Slender Man's pretty cool.
And next up, Josh.
Witches, like in general, witches, man. My whole life it's been like that. I think that it's because with like a werewolf, I feel like I could possibly outsmart a werewolf, you know? And a witch, I feel like I don't stand a chance. Like a witch can get into my head where a werewolf just tear me apart. And it's like, all right, just tear me apart. But you know, I remember I saw the Blair Witch Project alone in a movie theater in New York the night it came out. And I remember saying to myself that day, like, this scares me most. Witches scare me most, so yeah.
And finally, Riley.
Like Alma, mine would be Frankenstein because he's just, it's so sad when you think about it. Like, he didn't ask for any of this. Like, someone just cobbled together a bunch of body parts and stuck a brain in there and said, okay, you're human again. And, you know, how do you deal with that? Of course, you'd really be angry and you'd want to stalk, you know, your creator to the Arctic. But I just think that, you know, there's a lot of room for pathos in the Frankenstein story.
What is your earliest memory of horror, the thing that got under your skin and possessed you to write this spooky stuff? We'll start with Josh.
Okay, so the first scary movie I saw was Twilight Zone, the movie, and I must have been like 10. And what an introduction, okay? Because number one, it's an anthology story, so I got numerous stories at once, right from the go. But if you look at that movie for a second and look at the segments, the first one is like social commentary, right? In a major, heavy way, horror. The second one's more heartstrings. That's the Spielberg episode. So you get like this, almost this like, oh, horror can be warm, can be about aging, can be about friends. The third one is the imagination unleashed. That's Anthony, the kid in the house that removes his sister's mouth and sends his other sister into a cartoon. And the fourth segment is a creature feature, the monster on the airplane. And I think that for that to be the first experience I ever had with horror, it said to me like, it almost gave me like an entire education, you know, for a 10-year-old kid, like all of this could be horror. Well, then anything could be. So that was, I still watch it regularly now just to like check in and make sure that I'm following those instructions.
Next up, Riley.
Mine would be the Disney version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Yes, it's so amazing. And just as, you know, gosh, I forget how young I was when I first saw it on TV, because they always had the Halloween special every year on The Wonderful World of Disney, where they cobbled together their scariest things into an hour-long special, and they always ended it with the Headless Horseman. And just, he was so scary, and like the end of it where his flaming pumpkin head is hurtling through that covered bridge right at the camera, that just, I think it made like an imprint on my brain at that young age, and just made me think, I'm so scared, this is so cool, this is so fun. And I think that really just evolved into what I do now and what I like to read and watch now.
How about you, Alexis? What imprinted on you from an early age?
I hope this isn't blasphemous, but weirdly, like the Bible, particularly depictions of hell. So I grew up pretty religious, and I remember sitting in church and hearing all the fire and brimstone, like people burning for all eternity. And I was kind of scared that I would end up like that, but also I was kind of like, this is great. Like I was always really like more interested in those sermons. So yeah. And then I grew older and I read Dante's Inferno, and like, yeah, I just kind of had this like fascination with hell and like fear of it. And I think that really jump-started something at a very young.
I think it explains a lot about your book.
Yeah, probably.
And how about you, Alma?
Well, boy, first I have to say, listening to all these stories is sort of like sparking a lot of memories for me. And it's interesting how similar I think a lot of us, our experiences are maybe that put us on this path. Well, you know, when you first mentioned the question, I thought of Poe, because I read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe when I was very young. And by young, I mean like 7 and 8 years old. So probably too young to really understand them. But the weirdness, you know, and the richness of the scariness of the horror, I think really stuck with me. And for a long time, I really wanted the world to be like that, you know, really look. But Josh's story reminded me of, I was in a hospital for the first time when I was about 8 years old, and no one really explained to me what was going on. So I was just like there in this hospital with nobody around. Back then, you know, they didn't like let your parents hang out with you in the hospital. And I remember walking down the hall to where the TV set was on. They didn't have TV sets in individual rooms either. And there was a Twilight Zone episode on, and it was the one with the ventriloquist dummy. And this is the old one, so it's in black and white. And I just remember walking in and just having the living crap scared out of me. And to this day, I don't like ventriloquist dummies.
You're bringing back so many both warm and terrifying memories for me and for our audience. But speaking of some darker memories, have you ever written a scene in one of your books that terrified even you? And we'll start with Riley.
It would have to be the Pine Cottage scene in Final Girls.
Yeah.
And Final Girls is, you know, she survived this massacre and it's 10 years later and she doesn't remember anything about that night. And the end of the book, like there's sort of like flashbacks leading up to the massacre. And then, you know, at the end of the book, you get to the massacre. And I didn't know how I was going to approach it. I just knew that I wanted to write it as fast as possible and not spend, you know, I did it all in one afternoon and evening. And scaring myself as I was writing it, because you have to sort of put yourself in the character's place. I'm like, okay, my friends are being picked off one by one in this cabin in the woods, and I don't know who's doing it. I don't know what's going on. And I think I spent just like 7 hours straight just writing that scene. And then when I was finished, I was exhausted and scared, and I was scared of myself in that moment because I'm like, you really just came up with that, didn't you? You really just wrote that. What's wrong with you? And so that would be the scene.
I just got a shiver up my spine as soon as you mentioned that scene,
Yeah.
remembering it. Next up, Alma.
Oh, so, you know, this is where I play the little spoil sport usually. It's very hard to scare me. And I just say that because I had what for most people would be a very terrifying job for many years, where I studied genocides and mass atrocities for the intelligence community. And so when you see what happens in real life that people subject other people to, it does kind of burn out, I guess, your front end filter. So I kind of reconcile myself to like never being scared again. But now that so many years have passed, and because I've moved out to the middle of nowhere, where it's very dark at night, I'm starting to get that ability to be scared again. So the other day, I started a short story that has to do with body horror. And I won't tell you what the body horror is, but even that was like too much for me. And I actually stopped writing the story. But you know what Riley said about, you know, just having to terrify yourself, like take you to a point where you're like, what's wrong with me that I can think of that scene or that thing? That's like the job description of a horror writer, isn't it?
So the scariest thing is like confronting the things in yourself that maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I ask that question too sometimes when I think of something for a story. It's like, what's wrong with me that my mind goes there?
Well, how about you, Josh? What's wrong with you?
I love this question. It's not an easy one because then you start going through them and then you're like, wait a minute, they should be chock full of 40, scenes, and I suppose they are. But one that really stands out for me is from On This, the Day of the Pig, and that one stars a boy named Jeff who has a deadbeat dad, hasn't seen his dad in, I don't know, a decade or more or something, and the whole book sort of hinges upon a pig that sort of sloppily realizes that it has psychic abilities, right? That it can control the farmer and the farmers, the workers and the other animals and all this, and essentially create their reality. And it leads up to a moment where Jeff is in his bedroom and the pig has Jeff believing that the pig is coming down the hall, right? And so you see the shadow of a pig like sort of walking down this hall, and Jeff's like, I got to get out of this room. I got to get out of here. And he goes out the bedroom window onto the roof, thinking he escaped the pig. And he looks over and his dad, who he hasn't seen in like 10 years, is just crouched next to him on the roof. And he's like, hi, Jeff. And that, whatever that moment is, whatever the pig did to Jeff in that moment, I was like, oh, man. Like, wow, it was, he escaped the godlike monster of the pig just to end up with like the real monster in his life or something.
It truly might be the scariest pig of all time. How about you, Alexis?
There's a scene in my book where my character wanders into the dark wood near her home, and she has an encounter with this creature named Lilith. This was a scene that made me want to write the book. I had this image of this little girl kind of crouching at the feet of this creature with the body of a naked woman and the head of a deer skull. And she was just so helpless and so small. And I I think the reason it scared me so much was that I just became so obsessed with it. I would have nightmares of that image, and it just really like kind of got its hooks into me. Yeah.
That's a terrifying image for sure. But I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of terror, because it's often felt that the main point of horror is to scare its audience. But Josh, you touched on this a little bit before. What other effects can a good horror story have? So we'll start with Josh.
Well, one of them is, let's just take this pandemic, right? And you've heard like a few novels, like this is, even Malorie has been described as like, because of the masks and the blindfold, it's similar to the pandemic, or Chuck Wendig's Wanderers, and a number of other books that people are like, oh, this was predicted, or this kind of thing. And I think that what kind of the nice thing that comes out of that is that if we could foresee something like this, then we can probably also solve it. And it's not so, you know, these scenarios are not so far gone that they're beyond our reasoning or imagination. And so sometimes I don't look at horror necessarily as a safe place, like, oh, look, we can beat the monsters necessarily. But that is often like a nice byproduct of it. And also, for me, the thing that beyond the thrill and the surviving of the story is that I really value the imagination and ideas. And to me, the genre, horror is just ripe. It's wide open, be as elastic as you want. I just prefer to do that with the lights turned down, right? But that to me, horror has always been empowering in how wide the people can think and imagine.
Yeah. And how about you, Alexis?
I'm a deeply anxious person, and for me, horror offers like this safe space where I can explore my fear without feeling completely overwhelmed or out of control. So for me, when I'm reading horror, oftentimes it's this weird experience or exercise in catharsis. And I think that, you know, a lot of us who read horror kind of find some comfort in it. So yeah, I think that's like something unlikely that like horror does offer a lot of people, myself especially.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, horror movies are their comfort movies.
Yeah.
Next up, Riley.
I think what horror does very well, or can do very well, is put like a scary dark mirror up to society and reflect what's going on. Like there's been so many great horror books and movies that really are a product of their times. You look at Night of the Living Dead, then you look at, you know, Day of the Dead, which was all about consumerism, really. And, you know, just, you can slip a bunch of social issues into horror that you might not otherwise be able to get away with in other genres. And you can sort of sneakily do it where people are thinking, you know, like with Lock Every Door, like, oh, it's about a person in, you know, an apartment sitter in this creepy apartment building, and what could possibly be going on? And it turns out to be like this really like critique of like economic disparity. And I think, you know, other books you wouldn't be able to really do that, but you can do that in horror, and it's valuable.
And finally, Alma.
Well, what I have to say is really just sort of maybe another way of saying what the other authors have come up with. And that is, I think the best horror helps us make sense of the things that scare us. And this is something that I find a little frustrating with people who aren't into horror. And all they can think of when the word comes up is, you know, like slasher films, slasher movies or something like that, which are great and they have their place too. But horror, especially horror literature, and these days, as you know, as both Josh and Riley have said, these days horror is kind of a big tent. And there's a lot of different types of stories that find their way in there. But the really good ones help you, they make it personal in a way. And what I find is that, you know, you have the horror that's impersonal, that's sort of like just a scare and you go, ooh, glad that's over. But when it's something that touches on something that's important to you, an experience you've had, and then it just takes it deeper for you, right? So you have sympathy, you understand, it makes it, you know, it touches you in a deeper way. I think that's where the really best horror is these days.
Well, Alma mentioned that horror is a big tent, and I think that's a tent that's been getting bigger and bigger these days. There's a lot of talk about a new wave of horror and a renaissance of it. Why do you think there's been such a resurgence of interest in horror in our culture right now? And we'll start with Riley.
Because everything's terrifying. That's really what it is. Right now, everything is terrifying. And so I think sometimes it might be a little bit of an escape for some readers to be like, okay, everything is so scary. I'm going to read about, witches or the sinking of the Titanic with ghosts or something, something, and just be like, to take their mind off just the horror that is literally going on outside. So that's my blunt answer.
Gosh.
Brian Keene, the horror author, had a theory that he dropped on everyone in 2016, and he made a point to say this is not political, but every time there is a Republican in office, horror booms. And he says this, and you're like, all right, and then you start to look through history, and you're like, whoa, this is really crazy. There really is a direct correlation. And he wasn't saying that one necessarily necessitates the other, but he pointed it out. And look at the 80s, that's the biggest obvious, boom of all time. And I think if you kind of extend a little further than that, like a lot of us that are writing now were reared in the 80s, when it was like every week there was a different book or movie, and the genre kept stretching or being funnier or scarier or gorier, and everyone was trying to outdo each other, and between the novels and the movies. And now we are all grown up, and we all loved that. We loved what we experienced as kids, but we've also had 30 years between then, and a million other kind of books as well that aren't necessarily horror. And I think the result of that is you have a whole flock of authors that identify with the genre, but are coming from it intentionally from like a fresh place. So we're all like jazzed on bringing something new to the genre. But I think that it begins with being raised by, Stephen King. And Dean Koontz were our parents.
Next up, Alma.
Yeah, these are all good reasons, and it's hard. It would be great if we could actually figure out what is it that's driving this new interest. I think both what Riley and Josh said are very true. I remember early on, folks were saying, well, we're raising a whole generation that's going to learn to love horror because of Buffy the Vampire Slayer or the R.L. Stine books. So I think those are also some contributors. But then on the other side too, it does sort of seem like it's a weird thing, but when things get scarier, sometimes people are more willing to look to, books and film for comfort in that same area. It's a little, I don't know, it's reverse psychology, and sometimes it doesn't work. The other thing I was just thinking that I find kind of fascinating is like the big trend, and it's been the big trend for a while, are, psychological suspense that's contemporary. And so what does it mean that now horror is kind of blooming up, and you've got so many books that are sort of on that borderline that are psychological suspense, but then end up having either, some supernatural element to it, or opens the door to the possibility that the evil is supernatural and not, manifestation of a person. Or it's just a really interesting time for writers right now. You can almost go in any direction.
And finally, Alexis.
I agree with what everyone said so far. Particularly Riley, when you said like things are terrible, and so like people seek like scary things, and I think that's so true. At least for me, I think I mentioned earlier about like wanting to kind of control my fear or have some sort of like sense of like that I can own it almost. And when I read horror novels or watch horror movies, afterward I feel this sense of like triumph, almost like I made it, like I survived it. And I think that little like rush of adrenaline and like pride for having made it through something scary gives me hope that like in the world, the way things are now, that I can also like make it through this. So perhaps that's like a reason that people are turning more toward horror.
Wait, I want to add something too. Another reason is that diversity, because think about it, like the more diverse the genre gets, the more people are going to relate to it. And the genre has never been as diverse as it is right now, right? So that explains also like this excitement. I mean, there's new voices, there's new angles on it, there's new fans of it. And so, yeah, I mean, that has to be included in this because right now is a glorious, hopefully only the beginning of that, but it's a great moment for that in horror.
Yeah, I have to jump in. I agree. I've had the good fortune to be involved in a couple anthologies recently. And, you know, you go into it dreading that, oh, is it going to be a collection of the same old stories? No, because the authors are coming from all over and they're bringing fresh takes, you know, and insights and cultural, you know, themes and that sort of thing. It's really such a rich time for horror.
Yeah.
It's such a rich time. There's a lot of great stuff out there. What would you recommend to a horror newbie who asks you, where should I start? I want to start learning about this genre. Let's start with Alexis.
Oh God, there's so many. Mexican Gothic I'm reading right now. It's like absolutely, it's amazing. And it immediately came to mind when I started thinking of like diverse horror. So I would like start there,
Yes.
but I honestly feel like it's so hard to give book recommendations when I'm like trying to like coax people into horror. I always tell them like follow what you're most interested in, because I feel like if they get too scared to finish, like that kernel of whatever makes them like drawn to that book is oftentimes what'll get them through. So for a newbie, I would say like follow your fear and look for the things that kind of both scare and intrigue you the most. But also read Mexican Gothic because it's really, really good.
that book works even for people who don't think that they love horror. It's a great first step.
Yeah, everyone needs to read it.
Yeah, how about you, Josh?
I mean, I think I would probably start, like, I would direct someone to like a bunch of short stories, I think, because to me, horror is always the most like sort of potent and effective. Like the scariest stories I ever hear are like when I'm at a house party and I'm on the front porch and the guy next to me says, "Hey, you write scary stuff. One time I saw my dead aunt behind the furnace in my basement, you know," and then he goes back inside and I'm like, "What? What was that?" And then like that's the smallest story he could have told me, and that's scarier to me than most novels I've ever read. So I think that in terms of showing how powerful it could be, I would probably direct people to short stories or really of anyone, of any era. But then I also think of like people like Matheson, who wrote in a very like streamlined way, so any reader could easily slip in with him, and it's, you know, it's borderline sci-fi or Twilight Zone or this kind of thing. And to the person who might think that horror is all gore, which of course I love, but maybe someone else doesn't.
Next up, Alma.
I agree with Josh. I would recommend some anthologies. There's tons and tons of great ones out there. Of course, anything that Ellen Datlow edits is worth a read. I would highly recommend that one that I mentioned earlier, which is called Miscreations. There are some stories in there that are fantastic that I still think about to this day. There was another interesting one, Hex Life, that was all stories of modern witchery that came out recently too. And I just would like to give an advance plug to one that I did the forward for. I'm not exactly sure when it's coming out, but probably within the year. And it's called Black Cranes. It's an anthology of horror written by Asian women horror writers. And it is amazing and quite really just amazing span of that the stories cover. But I will also give a plug to Josh Malerman, because he is a fantastic storyteller. I mean, every one of his books, he's just a great artist. And I mean, you'll go in for the horror, but you'll stay there for the artistry. I really admire his writing.
Oh, thank you.
And finally, Riley.
I would start with Misery by Stephen King, because I think if we're going by like a strict horror supernatural kind of like definition, it isn't that. It is more of a psychological thriller. But I think it's a very good gateway drug to other books by him, and then he's a really good gateway drug to books by other authors. And I just, I think it might have been the first Stephen King book I've ever read. And I was riveted and I was terrified. And I just think Annie Wilkes is such a brilliant, amazing creation. And I think that would be a good gauge. If someone reads Misery and is like, yeah, this is my jam, then they're good. They can explore other things. And if they read it and be like, no, then horror is probably not for them.
So we're just about to move into the audience Q&A portion. So please pour in your questions by hitting the Q&A button when you're ready. But I have one more question for the panelists before we move into that. And that is there a genre or subgenre of horror you haven't written in yet? Like vampires, serial killers, cosmic horror. We'll start with Alma.
I don't think I've written a serial killer story yet, but I think that would be interesting. And I just finished reading an advanced copy of a book called A Certain Hunger, which is about a woman who is a serial killer and a cannibal. That's why they sent it to me, because of my book, The Hunger, was based on the story of the Donner Party. And I loved A Certain Hunger so much, maybe I'm gonna have to try a serial killer story.
Next up, Alexis.
I really want to write something that's equal parts epic fantasy and horror, like 50-50. I don't, if there's any book recommendations that fall under that, please like give them to me. But that is what I want to write, like an epic fantasy horror like series. I don't know if that's a thing that exists, but yeah, that sounds fun. So.
Hey, next up, Josh.
I'm gonna go back to a witch story. The first novel I ever wrote, you could argue, is a witch story, but I've always really wanted to put my stamp on that in my own way. And I think about it all the time. I roll ideas around. I talk to Allison about it, friends when we're drinking, you know, what about this? But I haven't got it yet or something. The witch story always eludes me. So, but that would be what I would want to pull off for sure down the road eventually.
Please do. I want to read that.
And finally, Riley.
I am a super huge fan of Jaws. And I would love to be able to one day tackle there's something in the water killing off people as they're swimming, and a village has to band together to, you know, fight it. And I would probably humiliate myself completely if I ever attempted this, but there's just like, I'm really itching to do it. And I don't know why. I think because I love Jaws so much, I just want to try to, you know, my hand at that kind of thing.
Well, I'm sure I join the audience and wishing dearly that every single one of these things happens. So moving on to the audience questions from Tessa. What was the first horror story or novel you wrote, not counting published pieces? And we will start with Riley.
Oh gosh. I wrote, it's probably been, gosh, like 20 years now. I mean, it was such a lame story. It was a short story about a guy who, he was a horrible human being, and he was like a tobacco, like, executive or something. And so like, and pushed tobacco on all these people. But he started seeing ghosts of people who died because of the product. And so in order to make them go away, he had to smoke, because the cigarette smoke would make them vanish.
Whoa.
And that's how he died.
Wow.
So that was
Wow.
Wow.
I mean, it's a great concept. It was not a good story. I have to say this, like the construction of it was not good. I will admit that completely.
Next up, Alma.
Well, I don't know if it was my first story, but an early one ended up like 25 years later being the impetus for The Taker, which was my debut novel. And the story had to do with a couple that was driving around a very remote part of Maine, and they were antique hunters. So they would go out to these, you know, isolated places and try to con people into selling their antiques cheap, and then they would take them back. Well, in a rainstorm, they smash into an ice house, a stone ice house, which is a little house that's set up off, you know, from the big farmhouse where in the old days, they would store ice to get them through the summers. And they get out of the car, and one of them is really badly hurt, and they stagger up to the house, and it's obvious that the house isn't occupied, but there is a woman there. it's a ghost story. And it's kind of like what Riley says. I mean, the idea is nice, but it's really hard to not be obvious in a story like this. So kind of hard to pull off, but I couldn't stop thinking about that story. And what happens is when they hit the ice house, they release somebody who has been sealed in the ice house for 200 years. And now he's free. And so that's the story that stayed with me, and that's where the taker actually came from. I guess I was highly influenced by the cask of, I'm going to mispronounce the word, the Edgar Allan Poe story about the guy who was bricked up in the wall. Because I seem to do variations in that story over and over again.
That's a good one to build on. Next, Alexis.
I wrote this short story about a woman who gets one of those hyper-realistic newborn baby dolls because she can't have children. And at first it becomes like this hobby, but the story is basically her progression into insanity. And by the end of the story, like, she believes the baby's a real baby and then kills it, and rips its head off, and And so I just, I like dolls. I think they're creepy and interesting. And so I think that I kind of like latched onto that. And then from that point on, I think everything that I wrote was almost could be categorized as horror. So yeah.
There's almost nothing scarier than those realistic doll babies.
No, they're terrifying. Oh.
And finally, Josh.
The first book I ever wrote is called Wendy. And when I wrote it, I've been trying to write novels for years. And I play in a rock band as well with my best friends, the High Strung. And if I had a small idea, or a short idea, we'll call it, it would become a song. If I had a bigger idea, I tried to write a novel of it. So for a long time, eventually, by the time Bird Box came out, I had written something like 14 novels and no short stories, which is a very strange thing to me, but a lot of songs. Anyway, Wendy. Wow, Wendy is about two friends who hear rumor about like this house in the woods that you go in whatever you want for yourself, whatever you want, whether that's sexually, financially, whatever it is, the life you want is inside that house waiting for you. Not outside, but when you're in there, you experience it. And these two guys are like, this sounds amazing, but there's rumor that the entity that runs it is named Wendy, and that she's not always nice about what she shows you, and that what you think is your ideal life not always is, and you kind of like end up facing your true self in this house. And the most exciting thing about this was that when I finished, as you can imagine, I was out of my mind excited, and I sent the file to my kid brother Ryan, who, I don't know if you can see this, yeah you can, who sent me or gave me this the next time I saw him.
Oh.
He like printed up a little freaking paperback of it. So this is Wendy. This is years before Bird Box comes out. This is my first book. And this was the first time I ever held something that I had written in a book form. And so, yeah, Wendy has an extremely special place in my heart. That was my first one.
Oh my gosh.
That was supposed to be scary.
Yes. I didn't think you were going to encounter heartwarming stories on the horror panel, but we got one. Okay, from Rhiannon. In your process, is horror better written from a well-plotted outline or pantsed from a single idea or scene? And we will start with Alma.
That's a great question. I really struggle between the two. Like, when I did my master's in writing, and this was a long time ago, they really pressure you for the organic, right? Literary is more organic writing. And so when I started writing more commercial work, especially thrillers, I found that you can waste a lot of time that way because you end up writing yourself into these cul-de-sacs that are going nowhere. So, but I kind of find I vacillate between the two. With horror, I find the biggest challenge is to not be cliche. That, people want something familiar, but they want it to be fresh too. And they want to be surprised and they want to be scared. And cliche is the opposite of that. It's the death of it. So to me, that's the biggest challenge. And if you can think of a really fresh take on something, you know, that's when you got something, and that's where I spend most of my time, is trying to come up with that part.
Next up, Alexis.
Yeah, I think for me, I think like one of the things that I kind of like struggle with, like with horror, I'm always trying to kind of like wrap my head around like whether I should plot a book from the start or whether I should pants, just like Alma. But I think it depends on the author and the writer and the book itself. So my process, I always say, changes with every single book. And I struggle with sometimes wondering like which one is best or which one is like the right way to write my books. I don't think that there is one. I think that you kind of have to trust yourself and the story and the characters, and that will dictate how the book is written. So, but I personally pantsed because I'm a little bit like chaotic and a little bit like dysfunctional when it comes to my books. And I go in with the best intentions of plotting the entire thing from the start, but then I normally kind of throw the plot halfway, like I throw it away like halfway through the book, and I normally just kind of wing it. This is my first book though, so I have a lot of growing up to do, I hope.
Next up, Josh.
I'm just enough Ed Wood in my personality to like consider an outline just a strangely told story. So I'm like, yeah, well, I mean, it's book, right? It's done, Allison. I mean, you got it all, right? The whole thing. All right, now let's move on to the next story. So outlines have always sort of like zapped the gas out of me or something like that, you know? But so I definitely am a pantser, and I love the phrase "write yourself into a cul-de-sac." I'm going to use that from now on. That happens all the time. But I used to say write myself into a corner, but at least a cul-de-sac comes back out, and I'm going to use that instead. But I did write one book, a huge one, with an outline because it was so big, and I gotta say it freaking helped. So I think ultimately for me, there's a few landmark moments. A few, you know, not necessarily scares, but often. And the idea is, okay, we got these three big scenes and we just got to get from one to the other and not know how. And I think not knowing how is, you can scare yourself along the way, surprise yourself along the way, kind of read it as you write it. And for me, who I value spirit more than I do really execution. So for me, I don't ever want to lose that part of it.
Yeah. And how about you, Riley?
I'm an outliner, very much so, but always knowing that it will probably and definitely and 100% change along the way. I think like for a lot of writers, especially in this genre, one of the things that you have to, that's difficult, is knowing how weird to get, or like how just bizarre to get, because sometimes you think of something, you're like, no, that is too out there, that's ridiculous, people are going to start laughing at it, that's so not scary. But then you think about it and you're like, maybe it's perfectly weird as it is because it is scary and unknown, and you know, no one's encountered it before. So that's like the hard thing, is just trying to figure out, will this work, won't it work, is it too crazy, is it not crazy enough? And sometimes you don't know until other people read it.
You know, Riley, sometimes I think that we have like an idea of ourselves, right? And then we have, as a writer, and then we have another idea of like where we want to be, right? And then we have this thing over here, which is stuff I would never do, or that's too weird, or that's unlike me, or that's outside of me. But meanwhile, we're trying to get to this other version of ourselves, and we're ignoring all this stuff that we say isn't us. Maybe if we try some of that stuff that we think is not us, that will actually lead us to like where we want to be. So sometimes I try to keep that in mind when I'm going like, is this, like you just said, is this ridiculous, man? And then it's like, yeah, but you know, it's also fresh, it's also new, let's try it. So yeah, I hear you on that.
So from Melissa, if all of your work vanished from Earth except for one story, already sounds like a horror story, what story would you want to keep? And we'll start with Alexis.
I only have the one book, so that's my debut, The Year of the Witching. So I mean, I guess I'd keep that. I sink enough time into it. I feel like it's a good start. I mean, I hope it's a good start. So yeah, I'll keep my debut.
How about you, Josh?
What a weird question, man.
It really is.
Anxiety to consider this. I love that question. But if I'm gonna play along. Unburied Carol. It's not the scariest one, but it has a super special place in my heart. It's also where I met Tricia with that book. It's just it seems to encompass more moods. Like Bird Box is one mood to me, and I love it for that. But Unburied Carol has many moods and many sides, I guess, of a writer, and I like that it's told in vignettes and that there's an ensemble cast. So I guess I would stick with Unburied Carol.
Unburied Carol is also very close to my heart.
Cool.
Yeah. Next up, Alma.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say you would keep Unburied Carol, because I love that one too. I mean, I really think that's a magical story. For me, I don't know, probably The Hunger, just because it really ended up being such a special book. You know, looking back, I'm really happy with the way it came out. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but for most books, I look back after it's published and I go, I would change this, I would change that, you know. With The Hunger, I can't really say there's any, and that was a really difficult book to write and went through some fairly heavy revisions. So to now look back and go, I still wouldn't change it. It makes me very happy.
And finally, Riley.
Final Girls. One, it changed my life, so that can't be underestimated. But also, like, I'm very proud of it. I'm proud of all my books, but that one especially because I wasn't sure I'd be able to do it, and I did it, and the response to it was beyond my wildest dreams. And so, like, that was the book that after it came out, I was like, if I never accomplish anything else in my life again, I'm good. I'm proud of this. So yeah, that's
Yeah, right on.
Okay, and from Jennifer, describe your typical writing routine. We'll start with Alma.
Gosh, it's really broken since we moved out here. Also because we moved into a house that wasn't finished. So every day there's a construction crew and that really makes it hard to write fiction. But normally I pretty much jump into writing as soon as I get up, which might be as early as 4 o'clock in the morning sometimes. Usually it's like 6:30. By 7 o'clock, I'm usually writing, and I'll write through to lunchtime. And that's when business starts to, you know, answer emails and that sort of thing. But, you know, in the best days, you're writing a story that you want to get back to. And so I'll write again in the evening. But I have found that I can't pull those marathon sessions anymore. And that by the time evening rolls around, I really need to take a break and just, you know, do something totally different. Which in the old days, when I had a full-time job during the day, I wrote at night. And so it's funny to me that I finally broke that habit. And I heard Josh has just done this crazy marathon session writing a book. I can't wait to hear about it.
Good. Like 10,000 words in
We'll
less
turn
than
to Josh.
24 hours, 10,000 words. It was nuts, man. It just,
Wow.
but without any strain, with no like, oh, I'm pushing, or like, oh God, I gotta do this. It was just like, oh, all right, let's keep going. I know, I still feel good. Let's keep going. All right, let's
My
finish.
God.
Where it was just, I just couldn't stop. I haven't been able to like determine from word count to time of day. It changes every time. When I wrote this, the big one, this 1,100 pager, I intentionally did less per day because I knew that I was gonna have to maintain the enthusiasm for the, if I went out with 4,000 words a day, I was gonna run out of gas, you know, a quarter of the way into that book. But one thing I have noticed is that whatever the routine is, it remains true for the duration of that book. So if I started writing it at night and I wrote a couple thousand words, well, that's how it goes. And it goes every day at night, a couple thousand words until the rough draft is done. If it started, Bird Box was written at between the hours of like 7 a.m. and like 11 in the morning. And I don't know why. That was rare. There's only been a couple that were done in those hours, which I loved, by the way. And that one was kind of crazy though. That was like 4,000 a day or something. But it was the same thing. I wake up, you know, every night I would be like, oh, I got to go to bed. Since when do you write early? I don't know. This one's written early. So I haven't found like a total routine, but each book is true to itself. Yeah.
Next up, Riley.
I am terrible at keeping a routine. I'm truly, truly awful at it. And You know, and I saw Josh and Alma both on Twitter like a couple days ago talking about like, yeah, I was up at 6 a.m. writing, and I was like, I hate you both. Like it's 11 a.m. and I haven't written a damn word yet. So thanks for making me feel bad, guys. Well, I don't. Like, it's whenever I'm like, okay, I need to write. When I have a deadline, and like I am on a deadline for my next book, like next week is going to be writing all day, 24/7 until this thing is finished. But sometimes it's like, yeah, I'll write in the morning. Or sometimes it'll be, 11:30 at night. Like, I can't sleep. Like, I guess I'll write for an hour or two. So it really, I'm all over the map. And it has been like for every book. There really has been no set like schedule or time.
And finally, Alexis.
Yeah, I'm the same as Riley. I'm a little
Thank
chaotic.
you.
I don't even know that I have a routine at this point. I mean, I make tea at some point, and I force myself to sit at my writing desk, and then I start making all these deals with myself, and like, or I hope it's with myself. Maybe it's with some like eldritch creature. I don't know. Maybe I'll have to pay one day. But I'm like, if I can just like write 1,000 words, I'll give you whatever you want. Like, I'll do anything, just like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, whatever it is. I do think that one day I'm gonna have to pay for that though, because I don't know who I'm making these like imaginary weird deals with. But yeah, I just sit at my desk and like hope for the best at some point. And normally though I average out to like 2,000 words ish a day if I'm really like kind of pushing. But I have days where I do a lot more and I have days where I do a lot less. So
from Victoria, what TV show influenced your writing the most? We'll start with Riley.
My books aren't anything like this show at all, but Twin Peaks.
oh yeah.
Because Twin Peaks, I mean, I don't think it was technically classified as horror, but man, oh man, it could have been. It was this whole other world I've never seen before. And I was fascinated, and I wanted it like injected into my veins. Like I wanted all of it right now. And yeah, so Twin Peaks, I think just that spirit of just weird things everywhere with everyone just has infused my work.
And I think Bob has always haunted my nightmares.
Oh my God, Bob, yes, yes.
I'm sorry to conjure his spirit into this panel. Next up, Alexis.
For some reason, the early seasons of The Walking Dead just are like sticking with me right now. I'm sure there are others, but those first like 3 seasons of The Walking Dead were just like so good. I don't think I've ever seen TV paced that well. I mean, it was just brilliant, and like the places they took the characters. Yeah, certainly like an education on horror too. I think it was just so good. So yeah.
Next up, Alma.
Well, it's probably a generational thing, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but I have to say it's probably Dark Shadows. I'm of the age where we would run home after school and watch Dark Shadows, this really kind of overblown, dramatic, gothy soap opera-ish, but it made this big impression on me. And I think Gothic stories were just super popular then still. So, it was easier, there's strings of them come out. So it just sort of fed into that culture. But I think a lot of women my age in particular were really imprinted by Barnabas Collins. Yeah.
and finally, Josh.
Oh my God, I feel like it's the most boring answer in the world, but the Twilight Zone for sure, because it was like you never really said if it was horror or sci-fi or mystery or this or that. And one episode would be like a Western, the next one would be a war story, the next one would be take place just in an old mansion, the next one in a graveyard. And I started to see, when I started writing novels, I started to see all my own books as episodes of a TV show where I suppose I would be the host. And Bird Box, I remember talking to my manager Ryan about this before Bird Box was shopped, about how it felt like a good like debut, like a pilot episode. I remember talking to him like, this feels like because this could go anywhere. This is a very small, quiet story. So the next one could be a Western. The next one could be a war story that, and so I guess it's Twilight Zone, but Tales from the Dark Side and which was so lo-fi. If you go back and watch that now, like you could make, like today, you can make an episode of Tales from the Dark Side just with your phone in your house. And, I've never, and that includes audio quality. I've never seen Twin Peaks though, man. I need to get on that. Like I don't even know like anything about it. I need to get on that. For sure.
You do.
So much.
I really do.
Okay.
Okay, we have just about time for one more question, and we'll take one from Laura. Is there a book you read as a child that led you to become a horror fan? And we'll start with Alexis.
I have a weird answer for this one, but it's Goodnight Moon. And the reason I say Goodnight Moon is because it took something I was scared of, nighttime in the dark, and then made me like feel comfortable and like safe and kind of explore my fear within that. So yeah, it's a weird book because I feel like it is so comforting, but it was the first time that I saw something I was scared of in a different light.
Next up, Riley.
The Berenstain Bears and the Spooky Old Tree. That one is classic. I think there's one like fold out where it's 2 pages and it's like you shows like the inside of the tree and you see like all the spooky areas inside that tree, and it just was like I wanted to live in that tree. I was terrified of that tree, but I also really wanted to go into that tree. So that would be it.
How about you, Josh?
Banicula. You guys all know Banicula and the celery stalks at midnight and the howl at AM. That was it. I was sold right there. Yeah, Banicula was like, it wasn't even cheesy to me that the rabbit was a vampire, you know, or they thought it was, whatever. Like there was nothing. I was like, oh my God, this is horrifying. So that was definitely mine.
And finally, Alma.
Gosh, maybe not at a super young age, but you know, like I said, there I was reading Edgar Allan Poe at 8. So, but I remember some books. One was called Octagon Magic, which was I don't even know if anyone's ever heard of it. I guess you'd call it like a middle grade book or something, but it was about a dollhouse that was in the shape of an octagon, and you know, sort of fantastical things sort of spun out of it. And then the book Half Magic, I understand that was a little bit more widely read, where you could make a wish, but you'd only get half of it. So you always had to say, I was a sad little lonely child. So I did a lot of, magical thinking, I guess, when I was younger, wanted my dreams to come true.
Oh, well, my dream right now would be for this panel to go on forever, but we're just about out of time. Our panelists, could you please tell the audience where they can find you online if they'd like to hear more from you? We will start with Josh.
It's just my name in all the places, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, just Josh Malerman, 1L. Actually, my website's fun now because there's a novel up there that I serialized like for free that Tricia witnessed the whole thing. That was totally insane. I wrote a book live and posted it, and it is on the website. So that website just became a lot more fun. And before whatever, because it's probably the last thing I say, I just wanted to say how awesome it was to be with you guys. And I love what you guys are all doing, and am honored to be a part of this genre with you guys. So thanks for having me, and thank you, Tricia.
Next up, Alexis.
I am on Instagram at LexisH and Twitter at Alex H. Writes. And it was super great talking with all of you guys. I feel like I learned a lot just like listening to you. So it was an honor. Thank you.
And Alma.
I'm Alma Katsu on almost everything, but my website is almakatsubooks.com. And I want to, just sort of echo this. I've known Riley for a long time, and I've known Josh for a while now too. And it's such an honor and so fun to reconnect with you. But I got to say, Alexis, you are absolutely enchanting. I cannot wait to read your book. I've heard so many wonderful things about it, but your answers are so delightful. I can't wait to meet you in person one day.
I want to meet you all. Yeah, you too. Really. Thank you.
And last but not least, Riley.
My website is rileysagerbooks.com, and there are links to all of my different social medias, which all have different things because there's another Riley Sager out there, so he took all the good ones. So there's like some hashtags and periods and things that have to be used. So just the website will have links. And yeah, this has been amazing. You guys, this was so much fun. You guys are awesome. And thank you, Tricia, for great questions.
Thank you so much for our panelists and to our audience for geeking out with us. and enjoy the rest of Book Your Summer Live.
And thank you, Brian.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Thanks,
Thank you
Brian.
all.
Bye, everybody.